This is John O'Brien. Going to give you guys a little bit of education on how to properly fertilize food plots. So many people send a soil sample into their lab and they come back with a recommendation based on an average yield. Potentially it could be clover or brassica, corn, soybeans, you name it, but it's based on that yield. They'll also recommend to put how much nitrogen, phosphorus, potassium down. If there's any liming requirements, that's attached there as well. And for those of you guys that spend a little extra money to check the micronutrients, you can also receive those. But how does those numbers come from? They're not magic. They're not put all over the air. They're not the lab, some guy sitting in a dark little area of the lab saying, I wonder how much I should fertilize on this property. Real numbers, real data, real life math and science application. So into a lab, most soil labs also do forage testing. And again, they have a bank of accumulated samples that have been sent in over a many-year history. But then again, depending on the lab, depending on the amount of repetition, the amount of samples that came in, it could be accurate, maybe not. There could be a range. For example, something like ladino clover that so many people are used to using in the wildlife industry, an average set of samples, there could be 5,000 samples that have been sent into the lab. It could have ranged from 13% protein to about 27, 28% protein. The mineral content could be anywhere from like 0.80% calcium to about 1.7, 1.8% calcium. Phosphorus levels in the low 0.20 range to as high as probably 0.45% phosphorus. Potassium levels, maybe 1.5% to as high as about 3.5%. Those could be big ranges, right? So very few people plant just one species in their food plots. So many people plant blends. So the numbers that the lab gives most people are kind of guesstimates. What do I do different? What could you guys do different? Here's what you do. You take your soil sample. You get the results back. You see how many units of phosphorus and potassium are there. And again, if your soil pHs are low, you need to use so many pounds of pellet lime or so many tons of ag lime. So let's just talk about phosphorus and potassium, for example. If we just use that ladino clover and you've got a soil, let's just say it's perfectly balanced. It's got 60 parts per million of phosphorus out there now. And let's just say it's got 150 parts per million of potassium out there. We're balanced, right? But we don't want to mine it down, and we don't want to go where we're wasting our money and also making some excessive levels of those nutrients out there. So for every 1 ton of growth out there, so many units of all those nutrients are mined from the soil. We could use an average value from the lab or what your average value is. How would we know that? You could go out there and take a forage sample and you'd see that it's 1% calcium and 3% potassium and 0.3% phosphorus. And then what we could do is you go out there and throughout the season, you could use exclusion cages. You could be in areas where there are lower deer numbers. Each time you're going out the clip, you can measure how much growth is still there in the areas where there's still quite a bit of growth. And again, what's mined from the soil is what the deer consume. It's not what is just grown. And if the deer don't consume it, those forages go back into the soil so there isn't nutrients removed. So that's why there's different ways, observations, and again, exclusion cages is one option. Or again, you could be using average values. Just say you have a history, or you could say to somebody like myself that's got a history, knows pretty well what the average yield is going to be for 1-year blends. For example, a little default that we tend to use for most clover blends, perennial blends, is 2 tons of dry matter per acre per year is what your normal growth is. So again, instead of just using that number, you could use different tools to measure. There's also a thing called a square. We'll attach a picture. Sometime we'll shoot a little video on what exactly is a square, but basically it's a square foot of space. There's 43,560 square feet per acre. You can weigh the contents, throughout the season of what's in that block of of forages in that square to come out with how many pounds is in that square, which gives you how many pounds is in an acre of land that's grown. And if the deer eat it, it's consumed, it's removed. So we take the forage test, we send it to lab. We know what's your average baseline. Could you do it once a year on your forages? Yeah. Could you get a hold of somebody like me that actually takes multiple samples of different blends I sell? Yes. And I could say, hey, this mix should yield about 3.5 ton of forage dry matter per year in your situation. And again, it's normally averaging like 1.2% calcium, 3% potassium. And again, we know what nutrients are removed from the soil then based on what my average yield goal is, based on a lot of repetitions, basically based on having a lot of different experimental plots around the United States. So again, so if it comes back to saying this mix will typically yield 3.6 ton of dry matter per acre per year. This is what it's going to remove for all those major nutrients. So again, then we got to back figure to see how much fertilizer we need to put down to keep a balance. Again, if your soil is excess, we don't need to put as many nutrients back in the soil. We're just going to draw down some. If your soil is deficient, then again, we need to increase not just what we're going to remove that year, but also to increase your nutrient levels, a little bit higher above to build up an actual reserve or get back closer to imbalance. So anyway, so that's my little tip on how to fertilize. Yeah, we can get in more depth, but again, so many people just think, hey, here's the sample, here's the lab, here's what I got to do. No, that's generic answers. But to get better answers, to dial it in better, we need to actually connect the soil to your actual forage analysis, and you could create a library. I'd say it challenges the next 2 years, especially on these perennial plots. Sample. And again, when should you sample? About 21 days after clipping. Then again, if it's the first cutting throughout the season, right when it's just starting to bloom or blossom out. Let's get a little database. How many people take forage samples? Next to nobody. So then again, you're relying on somebody that's using average values to guesstimate how much has been removed from your soil. Here's the other part of connecting the dot. So besides getting a baseline on what your forages test on your own property, you can see how efficient those forages are, how efficient they're mining those nutrients or uptaking nutrients from the soil. Because any soil that's deficient in a certain nutrient should also be deficient in that nutrient in the soil. So let's just say if that nutrient is not deficient in your soil sample, but it's deficient in the forage sample, that means you have bad nutrient uptake of that. Then you get to come back to a guy like me and say, hey, John, something's not adding up. And that's why a guy like me can be really helpful to people like you. And again, it could be a lot of it could be Mother Nature, what Mother Nature has been throwing at us. Okay. So a few little tips on connecting and how to properly fertilize according to soil and forage samples.